Welcome back. You're watching The Globe. In August 2021, a 6-year-old grade 1 learner in South Africa was raped, allegedly by a general worker in a school's toilet. Public shock and outrage at the ongoing onslaught against children has brought renewed attention to young girls in particular and their vulnerability to sexual violence. 1 in 5 children are victims of sexual abuse in South Africa, and that represents 19.8% compared to a global average of 18% for girls and 8% for boys. In the 2019-2020 annual crime statistics report, it shows that more than 24,000 children were sexually assaulted in South Africa. Well, to discuss the prevalence of rape culture in South African schools, where it emanates and how we can change it, we're now joined by South African Research Chairperson for Gender and Childhood Sexuality in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Professor Deevia Bhana. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there are 2 layers, I think, of sexual violence against children. Some of it children on children, and then others adults on children. I want to start with the adults, but I know that the children on children is also another very difficult, because in many ways both are victims in these kinds of scenarios. But let's start with the adult and child in the schools in particular. Why are we seeing such a prevalence in South Africa?
Well, this has been historically the case, and what the most recent incident in Soshanguve illustrates is the epidemic that confronts, in particular, young girls at school. And part of the problem has got to do with the ways in which a culture of violence, male entitlements, and a rape culture is a long-standing issue in this country. So in order to address the problem, we certainly have to address the ideologies through which male entitlement operates in relation to sexual aggression and sexual entitlements.
This is a difficult question, but is there a difference sometimes in the action of these perpetrators? Because you have children who can grow and mature quite quickly through puberty, and that they look at them as adults even though they're children.
Yes, this is quite complex because, in terms of the way in which law operates, age is an important marker that separates childhood from adulthood. So, for instance, a 13-year-old whose bodily presentation appears to be more of an adult is indeed, under law, still a child. And so the ways in which the body operates is clearly an important part of the sexual experience, and also rape perpetration.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about children on children, because that also happens. And I have to believe that young boys, if they're doing this, either have seen it somewhere or they've been taught. How is it that a child ends up raping another child?
So this is really an important issue, especially when sexual and gender violence are considered. We often seem to forget about the active participation of children, boys and girls, in rape cultures, in misogyny, and in violence. And clearly, the ways in which boys, for instance, take on masculinity and sexual entitlements is part of a broader system that operates within their social context. So we can't blame the boys, as you rightfully say. Both are victims. Boys are victims. They are victims of a broader systemic problem related to gendered ideologies, related to the lack of power, and related to the crisis that we see in terms of gender and cultural norms that position girls as subordinate and subservient and in service of men and boys.
How do we change this culture? I remember years ago, I was quite shocked to see when I first arrived in the country, walking down the street, and girls would walk past and men would just grab them, perhaps put their hands on their breasts in public, no question. The reaction the girls gave was almost, oh, go away. They didn't make it as huge as it was in my eyes. And I just wonder if it's something that both women and men have come to sort of see as a norm, this kind of groping and inappropriate touching.
I really like that example, because that's exactly part of the problem. And that is not only present in the streets of South Africa, but very well presented in schools as well. So the normalization of sexual violence and the normalization of touching and groping is a key part of the problem, and also part of the solution in terms of ending that sort of normalization where it seems appropriate to touch and grope as part of masculinity making, as part of what boys do. Boys are boys. We need to end that rhetoric. We need to come to terms with what is indeed violence and how we can name and call them out. The problem in terms of interventions are quite widespread. They require a multi-pronged approach. They require a kind of cross-collaboration across institutions and the state in this country. But for me, in relation to where children are at, and in the main, children are in families, they're in households, and they are in schools. And so for me, we could start in these institutions, in these contexts where children have readily available access to carers or parents, in order to address some of those ideologies which normalize gender and sexual violence. So, for instance, we have had widespread interaction with the #MeToo movement. And I wonder what that might mean if we have a #MeToo movement in schools. Or perhaps we could have a #0 movement. It's time to bring down the rape statistics to zero. And really have our eyes focused on that as a key agenda in order to bring school safety and gender equality in this country. So 2 of the recommendations would be, 1, start where children are at. We have children in a variety of different contexts and settings and places which require specific responses that are in line with where they are at. And secondly, we could begin these activist movements, #0, in order to work towards ending such violence.
I suppose also in a school setting, one of the challenges is being believed. And you report to someone and they play it down, or they question whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. For example, a teacher might come and put his hand on your shoulder and you feel uncomfortable, but then they will translate it and make it almost seem as if, no, it's okay, it's not sexual. How do we navigate these waters? Because if a child feels uncomfortable, it probably is because something uncomfortable has happened.
Exactly right. And so to extend those interventions further, then in schools, we need to develop comprehensive sexuality education that alerts boys and girls to touch, to what is touch, to what is improper touch, to educate and build a sort of confidence amongst young people about asserting themselves. But at the same time, assert themselves in ways that are in line with our constitutional prerogatives around gender equality and a rights-based approach. We need to support children's well-being. I'd like to ask, how often do teachers, or what mechanisms are in place in schools to ask boys and girls about experiences that they may not have exposed to anyone in their environment, in their home? So perhaps we could set up possibilities within the schools so that boys and girls can disclose the sexual violence or coercive practices that may be prevalent in their homes, in their communities, but also inside schools. So there's lots that we can do, but we're just not doing this. And to come back to the point about, the normalization of inappropriate touching, the normalization of sexual advances, it's also got to do with generational inequalities, with cultural norms that position men in particular in a hierarchical position, and where respect is accorded. And when respect is accorded, then it is difficult to contest those touches. But sexuality education should confront these issues so that young people are aware of their rights.
How far away do you think we are in making sure that our girls know actually their rights and they know that which is not appropriate? Because I do sadly think that there is some abnormal behavior that has become normal even in girls' heads, even though it feels wrong.
Yes, it's really difficult to predict. 20 years ago, it was reported that a grade 2 who was about 3 or 4 years older than the children in his class had raped a girl in a week-long orgy. And it's now 20 years later, and we are confronted with an alleged rape of a 6-year-old by a general assistant in Shoshanguve. And there are several other stories about rape. The National Development Plan of 2030 promises a school safety and gender equality by 2030. And we have 9 years to get there. I'm very hopeful, but I also have huge doubts, especially when the problem is very, very complex. It relates to social and political milieu, it relates to cultural norms, and it relates to not simply the demonization of men and boys, because men and boys are part of the problem, but they're very much part of the solution. We have to remember that not all boys rape, that not all men are violent, and that together we can indeed end this, but we need to start. And children need to have the support mechanisms in place to build on their confidence and their skills. They certainly have skills. They certainly have a sense of being violated. They know, and they understand. And we need to work on what they do know and build up their skills in that regard.
Professor Deevia Bhana, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you so much indeed for those very powerful insights. Thank you. Thank you for your time.